When my only grandson got married, I didn't say a word. I kept quiet about the $55 million I had inherited from his parents. They tucked me away at a table near the back, hidden behind a pillar, where no one even offered me a glass of champagne. I watched him raise a toast to his new bride while she leaned in and whispered that I was just the woman who happened to raise him. That night, they left me waiting outside in the cold. I didn't weep. I didn't shout. I simply smiled, but the thing about silencing someone is sometimes they're the one holding everything you want. I sat in the very last row that day, not because I arrived late. I had been there since morning, helping the florist set up arrangements. She didn't even know who I was. I didn't correct her. It was my grandson's wedding, after all, and I didn't want to be the reason for a scene. The sun cast a warm glow over Carmel Beach. White chairs lined up in perfect rows, decorated with soft linens and delicate pink blooms. Each seat bore a name tag. None for me. I asked an usher for help. He waved vaguely toward the back. So I sat down, saying nothing. Sometimes staying silent makes more noise than yelling ever could. Brennan stood at the altar, wearing a perfectly tailored blue suit. He looked dashing. My heart ached just looking at him. I had raised that boy since he was 8, after the accident took his parents. It was just him and me. I packed his lunch every morning, took him to every checkup, stayed up late editing college essays. And now I was a stranger at his wedding. He took the microphone and thanked the people who helped shape him into who he'd become. His coach, his college advisor, Sierra's mother. He hesitated for a second before continuing. He never mentioned me. Sierra looked radiant in her designer dress. At one point, she leaned over, touched my shoulder gently, smiled that perfect smile built for cameras, and whispered, "We're so glad you're here, Miss Forsyth. Not Grandma, not Marlene, just Miss." I nodded, smiled, clapped when expected. I even helped hand out gift bags at the end. No one gave me a second glance. The seat labeled for grandparents up near the sweetheart table. It had Sierra's grandmother in it. The other chair sat empty. Brennan never noticed, or maybe he did. I stayed through the final dance and slipped out quietly while the DJ played their special song. No one waved goodbye. Driving home, one hand on the wheel, the other gripping my purse, not for comfort, just to feel something real. I told myself not to cry, still, I did. Not the kind of sobbing that makes your face swell. The quiet kind, the kind that pulls at your ribs and leaves your throat raw. If you've ever been forgotten by the person you loved the most, then you know that silence. It's not loud, it's hollow, and that moment. It was only the beginning. 3 days later, Brennan called. He asked if I could stop by their new condo in Pacific Grove. He said he needed to go over some things related to the estate. His voice was calm, measured. I told him I'd bring lemon bars. Their place was all modern lines and cold surfaces, like a spread from a lifestyle catalog. Sierra opened the door wearing one of those beige matching sets influencers love. Her coffee mug matched her manicure. Everything about her looked curated. Brennan stood in the kitchen. He didn't hug me. He nodded toward the marble island. A sleek black folder with a silver clasp was waiting there. I set the lemon bars next to it. No one reached for them. He poured himself a drink and finally spoke. They'd been reviewing the finances, wanted to simplify things. Nothing major, he said. Just a few signatures to make things easier. I kept my hands folded. I asked what kind of signatures. He said I'd still be part of the trust, but more in name than function. Those were his words. He said it made sense for him and Sierra to have authority over decisions, so I wouldn't have to worry about all the responsibility at my age. He laughed as he said it, like we were chatting over coffee. Then he opened the folder and slid it toward me. I didn't reach for it right away. The top page said Trust Reassignment Addendum. That was the first red flag. I used to manage paperwork for elder care estates. The language was clean, too polished. I flipped through slowly. On the third page, I stopped. There was my name and my signature, written exactly like I signed birthday cards, but I had never signed those papers. My heart sank. It looked perfect, but it wasn't mine. I glanced up. Brennan was watching me. His face gave nothing away. Sierra was still scrolling through her phone, sipping her drink. I closed the folder calmly and said I'd need to review it. Brennan shrugged. Sierra said, "Take your time." On the drive back, all I could see in my mind was that forged signature. The way the letters curled exactly like mine, but I had never held that pen. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my confusion had turned to something sharper. I wasn't rattled anymore. I was focused. Not furious, just clear. Someone had forged my name, and if they'd gone that far, I had to know what else they were willing to do. Because this wasn't a mistake. This was a blueprint. That night, I didn't sleep, not really. I sat at the dining table with a cold mug of chamomile tea, watching the way the moonlight spilled across the floor. The folder stayed in front of me. I didn't need to open it again. That forged signature had already etched itself into my memory. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft, wrapped in politeness and sealed with a silver clip. Around 3 a.m., I got up and walked to the hall closet, the one I hadn't touched in years. Inside, behind a row of winter coats, was a metal lockbox. Mark gave it to me the day after his funeral. He said it was just paperwork, instructions in case anything ever happened. At the time, I couldn't bear to open it. I was grieving, trying to stay strong for Brennan, so I tucked it away and focused on being a mother again. That morning, I placed the box on the kitchen table and sat with it for a while. The latch clicked open without resistance, like it had been waiting. Inside were neatly arranged folders, faded and labeled by hand. One had Brennan's full name in Mark's handwriting. I opened it. Tucked between old school forms and custody records was a navy envelope. No return address, no label, just my name. I ran my fingers over the handwriting before sliding the letter out. It was brief. Mark had always believed in saying only what needed to be said. "If Brennan ever changes, you'll know," it read. "The original trust is on the USB. You are the trustee. You have full authority. Protect him if you can. Protect yourself if you must." I sat still for a long time. The USB was small and blue, nearly forgotten. I had never used it, never noticed it until now. I retrieved my old laptop from the closet, the one I used only for taxes and occasional recipes. The USB clicked into place, and after a few seconds, a folder appeared on the screen labeled, "For Mom." Inside were scanned PDF files, legal documents, notarized pages. My name listed as the sole trustee. Full discretion until Brennan turned 30. Not 24, not upon marriage, 30. There was a clause I hadn't expected. Any asset distribution required the heir to show emotional maturity, gratitude, and an ongoing relationship with the trustee. I leaned back in my chair. Mark had seen the cracks before I did. He hadn't just trusted me to raise Brennan. He had trusted me to protect the legacy, to hold the line when things got murky. The sun was rising outside, golden light washing across the neighbor's rooftop. The world outside looked unchanged, but inside, I was different now. I wasn't holding onto a version of Brennan that no longer existed. I had facts, I had proof, and I had options. The next morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Evelyn Doss. She used to be our estate attorney back when Mark and I ran the transitional care home in Monterey. She'd retired after her second husband passed, moved inland to grow tomatoes and live quietly. But Evelyn was sharp. Always had been. She answered on the second ring. Same voice. I told her I had some documents I needed her to take a look at. She didn't ask questions, just told me to bring everything by that afternoon. I printed copies of both versions of the trust, the forged one Brennan gave me, and the original one from the USB. I included Mark's letter and placed them all neatly into a folder. I tucked it under my arm like I used to do with patient charts. Evelyn lived in a small stucco house with rosemary growing along the front steps. Her kitchen smelled like coffee and thyme. She put on her glasses and read through every line. When she finished, she didn't say anything at first. Then she tapped the forged document with her finger and said, "This is going to be a problem." She pointed out that the signature page hadn't been properly witnessed. The notary seal was expired and digital. There were formatting inconsistencies only a lawyer would catch. Then she looked me in the eye and confirmed what I already knew. "That's not your signature." I nodded. She removed her glasses and laid them gently on the table. She explained my options. I could take it to probate court, report the forgery, start a formal investigation. But that path would be long, public, and painful. Or I could take the quiet route, file a fraud notice with the registrar, lock the trust, trigger a legal review. And while the process moved, gather more evidence. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked if she'd be willing to represent me again. She smiled, said she'd been waiting for something interesting to work on. By the time I got home, I had a plan. I went to the safe in my closet. Inside were old financial statements, my will, and a tiny voice recorder. Mark used to use it for staff meetings. Said people told the truth when they knew someone was listening. I charged it overnight. 2 days later, Brennan called. Asked if I'd had a chance to look over the documents. Said Sierra's cousin was an estate planner and could help explain anything. His voice was sugary, but I heard the tension underneath. I told him I'd be happy to come by. We could talk it over in person. He sounded relieved. Sunday afternoon, I walked into their condo carrying a Tupperware of potato salad and the recorder tucked into the side pocket of my purse. I turned it on before I knocked. Brennan opened the door with a wide grin. Sierra was in the kitchen uncorking a bottle of wine. We all sat at the marble island. The same folder was waiting, placed right where I'd seen it last. This time, Sierra did most of the talking. She used phrases like long-term strategy and streamlined control. She glanced at Brennan after nearly every sentence, as if seeking silent approval. When they finally stopped their pitch, I asked one simple question. Who notarized it? The room shifted. Brennan blinked just a beat too slow. Sierra jumped in, said a paralegal handled it. that the notary had since moved out of state. She talked fast, rehearsed. I let her finish, then smiled and said I'd need everything in writing. 2 minutes later, I quietly turned off the recorder in my purse. Back home, I backed up the audio to 3 different drives. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just documented, because that moment was the start of something they would never see coming. Monday morning, I drove into town. My first stop was the post office. I sent certified copies of the audio file and both trust documents to a secure box Evelyn had arranged. My second stop was a small print shop tucked behind the bakery. I had everything copied, stamped, and bound. The young man behind the counter didn't ask questions. He just handed me the envelope and said, "Take care." From there, I went to the registrar's office. It was quiet inside. The clerk behind the window smiled as I slid the manila folder toward her. "I need to file a notice of suspected fraud," I said. She paused for just a second before taking the documents. She asked for my ID, took down a few routine details, then disappeared into the back office. 20 minutes later, a supervisor appeared. Wearing a brown tie and neutral expression, he told me the estate would be frozen pending review. No changes, no transactions, no access. I nodded, said that would be just fine. When I stepped back outside, the wind had picked up. The air smelled different, like something had shifted. That afternoon, I sat in my sunroom with a pen and legal pad. I started writing everything down, each detail, every odd phone call Brennan had made since the wedding. How Sierra always interrupted when money came up. The sudden urgency behind the paperwork. Even the name of the paralegal Sierra had mentioned. I listed it all. Then I sent an email to a contact Evelyn had within the local bar association. She specialized in document verification. I attached a scan of the signature page and told her I believed it had been forged. While I waited to hear back, I pulled out old financial records. Not just mine, Mark's too. He had been meticulous, margins filled with notes, arrows pointing at critical lines. He had even labeled one folder "Future Considerations." Inside were spreadsheets, tax projections, and something unexpected. A draft letter addressed to Brennan. No date, no signature. But the message was crystal clear. He planned to pass on the estate. But only when Brennan had shown he was ready, not just financially, emotionally. He wrote that money wasn't meant for status or vanity. It was meant to be used with humility and wisdom. I stared at that letter for a long time. Then I placed it next to the recorder. Later that evening, Evelyn called, her voice steady. She said her contact had finished a preliminary review. The signature showed signs of tampering. A full authentication would take more time, but early indicators pointed to forgery. I thanked her and sat in the stillness of my living room. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about ethics, about intention, about the moment when a line is crossed and crossed deliberately. Outside, wind rustled through the rosemary bush near my window. I poured a glass of water and waited. 2 days later, Brennan arrived without warning. 2 knocks on the door. Then he let himself in like he still lived there. I heard his shoes before I saw him. He walked into the kitchen, looked around as if expecting someone else, then gave me that tired, practiced smile. He said he was just checking in, that Sierra was worried I hadn't been sleeping well. I nodded and offered him coffee. He declined, said he couldn't stay long, just wanted to reconnect. He stood, I sat. Same table Mark and I used to play dominoes on every Sunday afternoon. The trust folder was still there, so was the recorder. I didn't turn it on, not this time. Because that day wasn't about gathering more evidence. It was about drawing lines. He said he understood if the paperwork had felt overwhelming. That maybe I felt pressured, but they hadn't meant to exclude me. They were just trying to be efficient. That word again. Then he said Sierra had friends who could manage the portfolio better than any outside firm. They were just thinking about the future. I asked him if that's what Mark would have wanted. Plain, calm, he didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window, pulled an envelope from his coat pocket, and placed it on the table. My name written on the front, not in his handwriting. He said it was a revised version, one that better reflected what we had originally agreed to, a gesture of good faith. I didn't touch it, just looked at him. He said he didn't want things to get ugly, that family mattered more than paperwork. All the right words, none of the right heart. After he left, I opened the envelope. Inside was another forgery, this one cleaner, sharper. Clearly drafted by someone else, but still a lie, just better dressed. I called Evelyn. She told me to wait. Let them keep going. Every time they tried to cover their tracks, they were digging deeper. That night, I made a different kind of list. Not what I knew, but what they didn't. They didn't know the estate had already been frozen. They didn't know I had recorded to full meetings, start to finish. They didn't know Evelyn had quietly brought in a financial oversight officer. And most importantly, they didn't know that I had revised the final clause of the trust weeks ago. Mark had given me the authority. I used it. The new clause put a hold on all distributions for 5 years unless the trustee, meaning me, chose otherwise. I filed the amendment first thing the next morning. They thought they were bending rules. What they didn't realize was I wrote the rule book. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration. One line at a time. A week passed. No calls, no emails, no unexpected visits. But I knew they were busy, the kind of busy that involved whispers and legal pads and quiet panic behind locked doors. I kept my routine simple, watered the porch plants, returned a book to the library, picked up brown rice and figs from the co-op ... and every morning I reviewed the file, the forged documents, Evelyn's annotations, the registrar's confirmation. Every page became part of the wall I was building slowly, carefully. Then, that Friday, a new envelope arrived. No return address, just my name, printed in thick black letters. Inside was a wedding reception invitation. Not for them. They were already married. This was for Sierra's extended family upstate. A vineyard, printed menus, valet service. Under RSVP, someone had handwritten, "We hope you'll say a few words." I stared at that line for a long time. This wasn't an olive branch. It was bait. They thought I was softened now, maybe desperate to be part of things, willing to play nice if it meant a seat at the table. I didn't rip it up, didn't throw it away. I pinned it to the fridge with a little blue magnet shaped like a watering can. Then I sat down and made another list. This one was just for me, one column for Brennan, one for Sierra. Not to send. To remember ... for Brennan, the boy who once brought me soup when I had the flu, who cried when his pet frog died, and asked me if frogs had souls. Now a man who slid a forged document across the table and smiled. For Sierra, the girl who once showed up with wildflowers and called me Miss May with sincerity. Now the woman trying to erase my name from everything Mark had built. They weren't monsters. They were people. People who made choices they hoped would stay hidden. Choices that might have worked if I'd stayed the version of myself they remembered. Quiet, forgiving, willing to believe the best, but I wasn't her anymore. That Sunday, I called Evelyn and told her I'd be attending the reception. She paused, then said she understood, but she reminded me don't confront them. Not there, not yet. Just watch. Let your presence speak louder than anything else. So I bought a navy blue dress, simple, conservative. The kind that doesn't draw attention, but photographs well. I polished Mark's old watch, pinned my mother's brooch to the collar. When I arrived at the vineyard, the staff seemed surprised. My name wasn't on the seating chart. But Sierra rushed over in a flurry of pink cheeks and sweet perfume. She kissed my cheek and said they'd saved me a spot with the family. We walked past tables lined with handwritten name cards. They placed me beside a woman from Sierra's side who had no idea who I was. I smiled, ate the salad, listened. No one asked me to speak. No toasts. No acknowledgements. Just choreographed smiles and staged glances. Sierra's father gave a tearful speech. Brennan nodded along, the picture of a dutiful son-in-law, and I stayed silent. Because sometimes silence says everything. 3 days later, another envelope arrived, this one certified. From a law office in Sacramento I'd never heard of. Inside was a formal request to review the trustee status and suggest amendments to the distribution schedule, all phrased politely, legally, but the intention was clear. They were making a move. Strategically timed, just far enough from the reception to seem unrelated. But I knew better. I called Evelyn, gave her the firm's name. She didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. Then she said the listed attorney was known for high-stakes estate disputes. He didn't take cases unless someone promised a big payout. I thanked her, hung up, and sat on the porch. This wasn't just Brennan anymore. This was Sierra. She had shifted from subtle to overt. If lawyers were involved, it meant one thing. They were getting nervous. That night I pulled out a fresh notebook. I read her the entire timeline, not just events, behavioral shifts. The moment Sierra stopped calling me Miss May. The first time Brennan referred to the trust as his future. Every visit that changed in tone. Every breadcrumb I hadn't seen until now. At the bottom, I added the vineyard seating chart. The fact that I had been paraded in front of guests, but not truly included. That was a performance, not an apology. The next morning, I returned to Evelyn's office. She already had a folder waiting on the table and 2 mugs of coffee. She said the investigator she'd referred had completed an early analysis. The second forged document, the one Brennan handed me personally, had digital fingerprints. Metadata revealed it had been drafted from an IP address tied to Sierra's company. It wasn't definitive proof, but it connected dots. Evelyn leaned forward, voice low and steady. We have enough to make this very uncomfortable for them, if we want to. But then she looked at me and asked the real question. What outcome do you want? I didn't answer right away. So she slid a paper across the table. A letter, not addressed to Brennan, not to Sierra. To the law firm. A formal rejection of their request. It included scant evidence of the forgeries. A notice that all future correspondence would be handled through legal counsel. And a statement that criminal review was being considered. I read it carefully, then I signed. Evelyn nodded, and said she'd send it in the morning. That evening, I sat in my den with the lights dimmed low. The silence felt different. Not hollow, not lonely, but resolved. I took the original USB from its hiding place and made two backups. One went to a secure cloud folder, the other to a fresh thumb drive. I sealed each in separate envelopes and labeled them for dispute use. Before going to bed, I called the county clerk. I asked for a quiet review of the trust file, just to make sure nothing had slipped through the cracks. They gave me a date. I circled it in red on the calendar by the phone. No drama, no confrontations, just paper and patience. Let them scramble behind closed doors. Let them whisper over wine and rehearse their lines. I was done playing the part they expected. I wasn't just the grandmother anymore. I was the trustee, fully, quietly, without apology. 1 week later, I hosted a breakfast at my house. Nothing formal, just eggs, coffee, and a table set for 3. I invited Brennan and Sierra, told them it was important we talk face to face. No lawyers, no assumptions, just the truth. They showed up late. Brennan looked worn. Sierra wore sunglasses indoors. I offered them coffee. They declined. We sat at the dining table where Mark and I used to play dominoes. The silence stretched until Brennan broke it. He asked if I'd reconsidered, if maybe the situation had become too tangled. He kept his tone soft, measured. Sierra didn't say much. She just nodded at all the right beats. I told them I'd reviewed everything, that I knew exactly what they'd attempted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply stated facts. The original trust stood intact. All attempts to alter it without my approval were invalid and documented. I told them both documents had been examined, that the signatures were confirmed as forged by 2 separate sources. Brennan paled. Sierra crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair. "I think you're misunderstanding," she said. I shook my head. "No, I'm not." I told them the estate was now frozen under official review, that the registrar had accepted my filing, that the forged documents had been archived and flagged, and then I said something they didn't expect. I wasn't pressing charges. Not yet. Sierra sat up straighter. Brennan looked at me with something between relief and fear. I told them I wasn't chasing punishment. I wanted precedent, clarity. I explained that the trust would remain under my control for the rest of my life, that the 5-year freeze on distributions would hold, that future gifts or support would be evaluated by merit, not blood. I looked at Brennan directly, told him love isn't transactional, and respect can't be inherited through money. He didn't respond. Then I told them something else. I had started the process to restructure part of the estate into a foundation, not to revoke their inheritance, but to protect it, to turn it into something real, a legacy. Brennan asked who would run it. I told him I would. Then a board. People chosen not for their last names, but for their integrity. Sierra stood first. Didn't say a word. Just stood. Brennan followed her out. Neither touched their coffee. Later that night, Evelyn called. She asked how it went. I told her it was done. She asked if I felt better. I said I didn't feel lighter, but I felt clear. That night, I opened Mark's old journal, the one he kept during the early years of the care home. On the inside cover, he'd scribbled a quote from a nurse he'd once admired. "When you care for people, you don't owe them comfort. You owe them truth." I closed the book and sat with that thought. The truth had finally been spoken, not with fury, but with certainty. Another week passed. No calls, no letters, no visits. Brennan and Sierra had gone silent. Not out of peace, out of recalculating. The kind of quiet that settles in when a plan starts to unravel. I kept going, sorting through Mark's archives. Not just legal papers, but memories, speeches, photos, writings filled with grace and purpose. We used to talk about creating something lasting with it. Something more than just an estate. I realized the time had come. With Evelyn's help, I drafted a charter, a mission, a foundation dedicated to caregiver scholarships, elder care initiatives, and legal resources for women navigating inheritance abuse. Funded entirely by the assets Brennan once assumed were his. I didn't name it after myself, not even after Mark. I named it after my grandmother, the woman who raised me when my own parents couldn't. Her name was Elise. Strong, quiet, steady. By the end of the month, the foundation was legally incorporated. Real, visible, untouchable. Word spread slowly, through community bulletins at first. Then a local paper picked up the story after a quiet tip from Evelyn. They didn't include details about the estate or the legal battle, just a small feature on a retired nurse who'd turned her husband's trust into a nonprofit meant to outlive them both. I clipped the article, placed it in a leather folder marked private. 2 days later, a package arrived. No return address, just a single thick envelope. Inside was a typed letter and a check. The letter was from Brennan. He said he now understood that lines had been crossed, that decisions were made from fear, from pride, from voices that didn't understand the weight of legacy. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more than I expected. The check was made out to the Elise Foundation. $100,000. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I placed it between the newspaper article and the foundation charter, then slid the folder back into the drawer. That evening, I walked to the harbor. The air was cool. The water shimmered under dock lights like quiet truths surfacing. I sat on the bench where Mark and I used to share ice cream on summer nights. He once told me money's just a tool. A hammer in the right hands, a weapon in the wrong ones. For a while, I worried I had lost him in all of this, that maybe I had become too guarded, too hard. But sitting there, I saw it differently. This wasn't about money. Not really. It was about what we pass down that doesn't come with a dollar sign. Kindness ... boundaries, honor. That's legacy. And mine had finally begun. Autumn settled in slowly, like an old quilt laid gently over the town. Leaves drifted along the sidewalks. The days got shorter. My mornings became routine. Black tea, a walk past the garden, and an hour at the foundation's desk, reading letters from women across the state. Most were handwritten, stories of daughters erased from wills, mothers left behind after decades of care, grandmothers treated like placeholders. I read them all, not as a judge, not even as a guide, but as someone who had once been made invisible and found her way back. I started journaling again, not for nostalgia, for clarity. Each entry was short, not about laws or filings, but about stillness and resilience. One day I wrote, "Grief doesn't always end something. Sometimes it plants something else." By November, the Elise Foundation held its first public event. A simple gathering at the community center. No photographers, no microphones, just a circle of folding chairs. and women holding warm cider, sharing hard-won stories. One had reclaimed her home. Another had finally left a family that treated her like a burden. We didn't solve anything. We showed up. And sometimes, that's everything. Brennan never called again. Sierra sent a brief email around Thanksgiving, wishing me good health. I replied with a simple note in return. No warmth, no resentment, just civility. The house was quieter than ever, but it didn't feel empty. In the evenings, I played old records, cooked soups from Mark's recipe cards, watched the kitchen shadows stretch across the tile floor, and thought not of what had been taken, but what had been built in its place. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't vengeance. It was something steadier, something earned, and it was mine. As the year drew to a close, I knew the work wasn't finished, but the storm had passed, and I had weathered it without losing myself. Winter arrived gently, no blizzards, just a hush that seemed to settle over everything. One spent most mornings at the foundation, most nights at home, surrounded by small comforts. One afternoon in December, a letter arrived. Handwritten, shaky script, from Brennan's first-grade teacher. She was long retired, but had seen the article in the paper. She said she remembered me how I used to wait by the fence after school with a thermos of soup and an extra pair of gloves. She wrote, I always knew Brennan was deeply loved. I folded the letter carefully, placed it between the check and the charter. I didn't cry, but I sat with it for a long time. Later that week, a final document came in from the registrar's office. The Elise Foundation had passed its endowment threshold. The assets were now protected, secured for good. Not just in my lifetime. Beyond it, on Christmas Eve, I lit a candle in the window. Not for company, not for ceremony, just for me, a small flame for the version of myself who had once gone unnoticed. For the woman who had stayed silent too long. For the one who had finally chosen to speak. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't proud, I was whole, and sometimes that's more than enough, if you've ever felt invisible. If the years you gave were overlooked, dismissed, or taken for granted. This story is for you. Because sometimes silence isn't peace, it's just the pause before you choose yourself again. And if any part of this reminds you of your own path, or someone you love, I hope you carry that strength with you. Thank you for listening. You're not alone.